At the edge of nowhere, beyond the reach of time, where the wind no longer blows and the moon no longer shines, and the forest is dead and covered in vines, stands a forgotten old train station where the clocks no longer chime. When the moon is high and the earth will glow, then through the tunnel to station you'll go. When you finally get there, you will know there are places where evil can freely flow. The owners are gone, no one really knows why, but something lurks within its halls, giving mournful cries. Those foolish enough to visit will behold with their eyes that the station of shadows is still very much alive. Don't go inside and wander its halls. Don't attempt to follow the playful calls. Don't try to leave through the forest of walls, and don't go into the bathroom stalls. So take heed this warning and tread lightly with care, or you will join the others, permanently living there. Old Foals Nursery Rhyme. A Night at Shadow Station. Written by Mr. Nelg and read by Thornquill. Act 1, Scene 1. The train rattled along west through the darkness of the forest, its shrill whistle piercing the otherwise quiet night air. From the rear of the last carriage, Fluttershy stared out the window with an expression that was a combination of boredom and exhaustion. She was finally returning home after visiting a veterinarian's conference in Manehatten. She had always been meaning to build up the courage to visit one of those, and now, after her many adventures with her dear friends, she at last had the confidence to go. It was good to meet others who cared for animals and swap techniques, ideas, natural remedies, and even humorous stories. She'd shaken hooves with famous professionals, rank amateurs, and even the downright quirky. One mare she'd had the misfortune to run into had been a sales pony representing the Philadelphia Iron Works. She'd tried to convince Fluttershy that she needed an iron fence after overhearing her discussion about how best to care for bears. Oh, she did not want to let her go. That mare drawled on for at least 45 minutes about all the uses for iron, ranging from mystical to scientific, before she overheard another conversation that could have been a bigger score than Fluttershy, and that was how she managed to escape her. She gave an amused sigh. It had been a rather hectic, but nonetheless enjoyable, weekend that was finally all over. Now, she just wanted to get back home to Ponyville and see all her friends again, particularly Angel Bunny. She yawned broadly, her jaw cracking from the lack of movement as she idly batted at the empty water bottle that lay beside her. She blinked her eyes a few times and looked out at the passing scenery. What little there was to see of it. It was dark outside, with only the tops of the trees illuminated by Luna's moon, which hung high in the night sky, shining proudly down upon the earth below. Its friendly glow bathed the surrounding countryside in a calming white hue that appeared to make everything it touched sparkle and dance with a life of its own. The line she'd chosen to ride wasn't the same line she'd taken to Manehatten. This one was more of an indirect route with stops in the remote parts of Equestria, but it was the only train that night stopping at Ponyville. All others heading in that direction were express. Fluttershy did not mind. With the moon so bright, she'd enjoyed seeing what little there was of the new scenery. As she observed the landscape outside, she noticed that the tracks had split off, curving away into the forest. They ended not far away from the main tracks at a buffer stop. However, the tracks themselves continued on, disappearing into the trees. Fluttershy yawned again. She wondered if she would ever be able to get some sleep. There had been countless times where she'd nearly dozed off, only to be rudely awoken when the train hissed and screeched to a halt at some tiny prairie town, allowing its passengers to disembark. Looking around, she confirmed yet again that she was still the only pony on the train. She hadn't been when the journey started. The carriage had been full of ponies. As the train rattled further and further west and made stop after stop, their numbers had dwindled away until she remained the only passenger. The last stop had been a tiny little hamlet, where the station had been nothing more than a raised stone platform with a shelter, timetable board, 2 lights, and a sign that was barely visible. The last of the train's passengers, all 4 of them, had hurried onto the platform. The train didn't stop long before starting up again. At a middle-of-nowhere place like this, you were lucky if the train stopped at all. No more ponies joined her on the train. According to the map on the carriage wall, this was the last stop. It would be a clear run all the way through to Ponyville. Fluttershy knew the train wasn't going to reach the little town until sometime early in the morning. She had no idea what time it was now and wished that she'd brought a watch. At first, she had not needed it, as there were so many big clocks in Manehatten and all the train stations that it hadn't hindered her in the slightest at all. Now, the cloak of boredom was beginning to settle across her, and although being alone hadn't bothered her in the slightest, she was starting to pine for her friends again. Her eyes floated up to her overnight bag, secured up in the rope net that was the train's light baggage compartment. She had only packed the bare essentials for the trip, and had foolishly neglected to bring anything of entertainment value, like a book. For what felt like the 100th time, she wished she had not spent those extra bits so she could have purchased that copy of Better Tree Homes and Gardens, whose cover had so tantalized her back at the Manehatten train station. She had restrained herself from spending all her money because she wanted at least a few bits so she could buy Angel Bunny a treat when she got home for being such a good boy while she was gone. Her eyes turned downwards towards the empty water bottle she had been toying with. Maybe she shouldn't have bought that bottle of spring water back at the station, but she had been very thirsty at the time, and the label had been so inviting. She glanced back out the window. Just then, the moonlit landscape outside was obscured as the train entered a dark tunnel. With nothing now to look at except the black, rocky walls outside, she turned her attention on the interior of the carriage. As her droopy eyes surveyed over the empty seats, she began to wonder if she had bought that magazine, would it be necessary now? Her mind felt sluggish from being awake all night, and she was now having trouble focusing on objects at the far end of the carriage. A third yawn escaped her mouth. Laying her head down, she curled up on the train seat. She closed her eyes yet again, and her ears began to focus on the sounds surrounding her. The train traveled over another joint in the tracks, but this time it did not jolt her eyes open. Her body started to relax as her breathing slowed down. Her mind was now solely devoted to concentrating on the noises of the train. The rhythmic clicking of the train's wheels as they regularly turned under the power of the locomotive, the soft hissing of the pistons as the wheels chugged along, the slight creaking of the light bulbs as they swung with the gentle rocking of the carriage. She sighed contentedly and never paid any attention when the lights flickered out and refused to turn back on. The darkness only made her tired body relax even more. Curled up on the train seat, she finally managed to fall into a deep, peaceful sleep. The train doors slid open with a loud bang, which reverberated around the entire carriage. Fluttershy awoke with a start, her head shooting up and her eyes darting around in every direction like a panicked animal. The first thing she was aware of was that the train had stopped. The second thing she was aware of was that she was now at a train station.
"Oh my!"
she gasped, jumping off the seat and landing on all 4 hooves with an audible thud.
"We're here already?"
As she prepared to fly up to the light baggage compartment to fetch her overnight bag, she stopped. The third thing she was aware of was that it was still night outside. Fluttershy blinked in confused curiosity and walked over to the window, peering out. The train station's lights were beaming brightly outside, but beyond the edges of their yellow glow, she could perfectly see the inky blackness of the night. Her eyes narrowed in confusion. This wasn't right. She knew that the train was to get into Ponyville Station in the early morning, but Celestia's sun should at least be showing some of its warming golden rays, peeking over the tips of the mountain ranges. She pressed her face up against the window to look at the station for any signs of identification. She spied a large, dilapidated white sign with a green border, containing green lettering that arched across an entranceway to a tunnel. Unfortunately, many of the letters were broken beyond recognition, or had simply fallen off and had failed to be replaced. What had once been a proud sign, welcoming visitors to the station, now only displayed the incomprehensible Wasior Mono. Now Fluttershy's brow twisted in confusion. She'd never heard of that town before. Come to think of it, the map made no mention of there being a station between Ponyville and the last one. A quick check of the map confirmed that was true. After a few unsure blinks, she quickly shrugged it aside. Stopover or no stopover, this wasn't her station. She'd just have to wait for the passengers to embark and the train to start moving again. She was about to sit down when she paused. Another unusual sight, which she'd rather embarrassingly failed to notice until now, was that the platform was devoid of all life. Again, she pressed her face up against the window as her eyes scanned up and down the length of the platform. Not one pony was present. Of course, the logical answer that jumped up and down was that every pony had either boarded or left the station. However, a more thorough examination left Fluttershy with the impression that no pony had even set hoof on this platform in a good many years, possibly even before she was born. Her limbs were slightly trembling as she leaned away from the window to look back at all the seats. She was still alone. She felt her head subconsciously shrinking back into her mane, a habit she always did when frightened. It reminded her of that horrible night she was lost in the Cloudsdale Art Museum. She'd been so enraptured by the beautiful and colorful pictures of animals that she'd accidentally wandered away from her parents, just as the museum was closing down for the night. She had been locked in, and started to panic once all the lights went out. She could still vividly remember walking through the empty halls of the gallery, her hoof steps echoing loudly on the floor. Once or twice, she heard a distant noise, like some unseen monster was stalking her. She had run away from the sounds, but the sounds kept following her everywhere she ran. Her panicked flight took her into the art wing, where she cowered under the watchful eyes of the portraits of Pegasi that lined the walls. Rushing through the deserted, lengthy halls, she had imagined that they were watching her, waiting till her back was turned so that they could leap out, grab her, and drag her into the paintings with them. It all came to a nerve-jarring end when she left the portrait gallery and found herself in a room full of sculptures. There, she ran headlong into a massive statue of a grotesque-looking diamond dog, looming over her, ready to strike. She'd screamed louder than she ever remembered in her entire life. Then the lights all came on, revealing the statue as that of a pharaoh hound diamond dog god from that respective species' culture. Of course, now that she was older and wiser, she knew that it had just been her imagination running wild in the dark. The sounds of the unseen monster that was stalking her ended up being a security guard sent to find her by her frantic parents. Now, these fears of being alone in the museum were returning, and she felt like that terrified filly all over again. Getting up on shaking legs, she hesitantly walked down the carpeted aisle towards the doors that separated her carriage from the next. She passed through the first door, and walking up to the next one, cautiously peeked in through the window. This carriage was as empty as her own. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. A quick survey confirmed what she'd seen from the window, that it was still empty. She walked down the aisle of the carriage towards the next one and peeked in through its window. The same empty sight greeted her. She pushed open the door and walked all the way to the end. Now she was at the very end of the train. There was nowhere left to go but either back the way she'd come or out onto the platform. Casting a look over at one of the doors, she trotted over to it and tested the handle experimentally. The door slid open with a loud thump, which echoed into the night. Fluttershy took a frightened step back as it did so. She looked up from the door to stare out at the empty station platform. She really didn't want to go out there. Her limbs were trembling with trepidation at the thought of being out there, alone. Then an idea appeared before her. Maybe she wouldn't have to. If there were some pony here, she could call out to them from the safety of the train. Swallowing the nervous lump in her throat, she slowly and cautiously stuck her head out. Just as she'd seen from the window, the platform was as deserted as the train. She tried to call out, but her jaw just worked silently. Taking a deep breath, she tried again.
Hello?
She nervously squeaked.
Is there any pony here?
Only silence responded. She looked up and down the length of the platform, spying no signs of life. She looked down at the said stone platform just before the carriage door. She wasn't going to find any pony standing here. She turned her head towards the locomotive just next to the carriage door. Surely the engineer or fireman would be able to tell her what was going on. She once more looked down at the platform. She told herself it would be all right as the cab was just a few feet away and she wouldn't be out here very long. She took a cautious step out, testing the platform beneath her hoof. It felt solid and real. It also felt cold. Next came her other hoof, and then she was standing fully on the platform. She cast one more hopeful look down the length of the station before turning and trotting over to the cab.
Excuse me, sirs,
she spoke in her usual diminutive tone.
I was just wondering why.
Her voice trailed off just as she stuck her head into the crew compartment. It was empty. She blinked in a mixture of fear and surprise. Where was the train crew? Surely they wouldn't just abandon their train like this. They had a job to do, schedules to keep, a train to run. This just didn't make any logical sense. Eager to get off the platform, she walked inside and looked around. The cab was cramped and full of all sorts of valves, levers, and gauges. Behind her, the coal car was full of coal while the lid of the firebox remained shut. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist. Although there were lights within, it was still too dark within the compartment for her liking. Again, Fluttershy swallowed the nervous lump in her throat, which proved a tad bit more difficult this time, and turning around, stuck her head out of the cab. This time, as she looked down the platform, she observed the train station as a whole. The actual building was two-story wooden buildings with gablet roofs joined in between by another structure with a hip roof, which served as a bridge between the back half of the two upper floors. A sloping wooden roof covered the front half. There was a chimney on the left building, and what appeared to be a water tank nestled around the side. The opposite building was identical, save for what looked like an exhaust stack protruding oddly from the building's side. A sloping wooden overhang protruded from between the first and second floor, under which hung light bulbs that now glowed a golden yellow. The whole building had once been an orange-brown color, but the paint had flecked away over the years, leaving multiple patches of the dark, black wood beneath. The tiles on the roof were old, weathered, and amazingly still in place. In the middle of the station buildings, beneath the bridge construction, was an arched tunnel, above which the incomprehensible welcoming sign hung. The platform on which she now stood was raised stone, which had once been a Spanish gray, but now a dark shade of charcoal. Two flaking green wooden picket fences acted as guardrails at either end of the platform. Fluttershy received a queer sensation from the entire structure as she eased slightly back into the cab. Something about this place seemed to radiate trouble, for warm and welcoming buildings should not stare at their guests so slyly and hauntingly. After taking in the decrepit look of the whole place, she glanced up at the glowing station lights. This place could not be abandoned. These lights had to be powered by something, and electricity needs to be monitored and serviced. She looked around at the rest of the station. Then why was it in such neglect? Nothing about this train station made any sense. She looked back down at the platform just below her. She had to force her nerve-racked limbs to climb out of the cab and into the light of the station. Again, she shrank back into her mane before she gradually crept down towards the far end of the platform and, making sure to keep within the boundaries of the station lights, took in the surrounding open, grassy area. Although overgrown, they appeared to retain some elements of a manicured nature a little too well to warrant complete desertion. As her roving eyes fell and then lingered upon the darkened forest beyond the grassy grounds, her flattened ears became aware of the ambient noise. Or rather, the lack of. Usually, the night would be alive with thousands of sounds. There would be crickets chirping, owls hooting, the rustling of leaves, the scraping of branches, the howling of the wind as it blew through the forest. There was only dead silence. Her ears automatically flicked into an upright position, and, standing very still, Fluttershy turned her ears side to side, trying in vain to find even the minutest of sounds. That's when her peripheral vision caught sight of another peculiar oddity, and slowly she tilted her head towards the night sky above. She could only gape in shocked disbelief at the sky above her. It was completely black. No stars, and no moon. The sky should have been alive with a swirling jumble of billions of stars in a continuous spiral of white light and crowned by the ever-present moon of Princess Luna. The sky above was just black nothingness that stretched across the heavens and beyond. Now Fluttershy felt her entire body lock up with fear. Being a Pegasus, she understood the weather as much as she understood animals. The lack of a sky above her terrified her more than that time she'd been forced to visit that dragon's cave. For what seemed like an age, she stood there, rooted to the spot and unable to budge an inch. Why was the sky gone? Where was the moon? Had the princesses abandoned Equestria? A million ideas flowed through her mind like out-of-control rapids, crashing into each other and smashing against rocks, leaving her unable to form even a single coherent thought. Unable to stand the confusing sight any longer, one thought at last flashed all around her mind like a warning light. Run! Without a moment's hesitation, Fluttershy bolted for the train, her wings propelling her into the first carriage in under a second. Stopping only to grab the door handle with her teeth, she slammed it shut before diving under the nearest bench. There she huddled, hiding within her mane while her tail lay curled protectively around her as she shivered violently. Her eyes were squeezed shut as she muttered at breakneck speed for the sky to come back. Finally, she was aware that her mutterings had become unintelligible, and she was only spouting gibberish. Ceasing her jumbled speech, she opened one eye and then the other. Nothing had changed. Still, she remained huddled under the bench, shaking, all the while her rapid breathing and the fierce pounding of her heart being the only sounds she heard. Perspiration matted the fur upon her brow as her eyes nervously darted all around her. What was going on? Where was every pony? She waited under that bench for what must have been an hour, before eventually sliding her head out to look up and down the length of the carriage. It remained frustratingly empty. Willing herself as hard as she could, Fluttershy eased out one hoof, then the other. Finally, she managed to coax her entire body out from under the bench, and she once more stared out the window at the station. Her eyes began to scan the nearest building. Was every pony inside? Her roving eyes fell upon the nearest window, which, although old and almost opaque with dirt, wasn't broken. The building may still be inhabited despite its general neglect. She angled her head so that she could see the night sky. Like the train carriage, it too remained devoid of life. She turned back to the window. Behind the layer of dust that coated the outside, there were no signs of light beyond, and she chewed at her lower lip in conflicted thought. Should she go out there? No, she couldn't. But what if there were ponies in that building? No, not with all the lights out. But what if they were hiding, just like she was? No, she'd have all the lights on, even if she were hiding. Dejected, Fluttershy moved away from the window and lay down on the bench, crossing her front legs and resting her head on them.
I just want to go home,
Fluttershy whimpered. She closed her eyes and began whispering,
Please let me go home,
over and over, until it was obvious that it wasn't going to work. Once more, she rose her head to stare out the window at the train station. The darkened windows returned the stare. She angled her head to look once more at the sky. Just like the station, it remained exactly the same as before, black and empty. Why was something like this happening? She ruled out Discord, because he wouldn't be so mean as to pull a prank on her of this magnitude. Was there some new threat to Equestria? If so, were the other elements of Harmony searching for her so that they could put a stop to it? She looked back at the train station welcoming sign that was still illegible. Where was she? If she was lost and there was some new danger, it would be a good idea to find out where she was so that she could have some clue in which direction Ponyville lay should she have to head back under her own power. She looked over at the nearest door. Her whole body began to shiver with anticipation at the thought of entering that big, dark, scary-looking building. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath as she remembered the words her father had spoken to her after she'd been rescued from the museum. The dark is nothing to fear, because there is nothing there but our own imagination. She let out a quiet, hissing breath and opened her eyes. Carefully, she climbed down off the bench and opened the door. It slid back with the same loud thump as before, causing her to jump a little. Carefully, she edged out of the carriage and onto the platform. Looking both ways, like a filly about to cross at an intersection, she slowly trotted over to the nearest window. She cautiously attempted to gaze into the darkened glass before using her right hoof to wipe away the dust, and after muttering in disgust, peered inside. A pair of hazel eyes blinked back at her. Fluttershy let out a startled squeak and reared back from the window. She blinked her own eyes in rapid confusion before realizing what it was that she had seen. Another pony. She was not alone. She looked back at the window, but the eyes were gone. She shoved her face up against the glass and looked around inside. She tapped her front hoof on the window.
Hello?
She called out.
Excuse me, but could you tell me what station this is?
There was no reply.
Please,
She called out, raising her voice ever so slightly.
I need to know where I am and what happened to the train drivers.
Silence. She tapped her hoof on the window once more.
Can you at least tell me where the town is?
She asked. Still nothing. Backing away from the window, Fluttershy kept a wary eye on it all the same, just in case the eye's owners returned. They did not. This caused Fluttershy's suspicion to deepen. Why would they hide from her? Granted that if the situation were reversed, she'd probably do the same with the sky gone, but she'd still be happy to see any pony. Turning away from the window, she searched the building for any signs of an entrance. There was a small side door located a few feet from the window. She covered the few steps to reach the door and politely knocked.
Hello?
She called out.
Please, whoever you are, I need help.
She blinked in slight agitation at the silence that followed. Reaching out her front hoof, she tried the rusty door handle and, finding it unfastened, opened it. The door creaked on rusty hinges, creating a loud groaning sound as it protested the years of immobility it had endured. Fluttershy instinctively took a step back as the door swung inwards, banging lightly against the wall. Swallowing down the lump of fear that was building in her throat, she peered cautiously into the darkness.
Hello?
She called out, her voice a noticeable octave lower. The whole inside of the room was in pitch blackness, but the light shining in from the outside did light up enough of the room to make out the basic details. It was an office, most likely for the staff of the station, and her muzzle wrinkled in disgust at the state of the room. All the tables and chairs were overturned and broken. No doubt about it, something violent had taken place here. Dust, cobwebs, and old food packets littered the floor and walls. There were lockers up against the wall by the window, long rusted shut, while against the back wall was a door to the washroom. On the wall opposite the window was a set of 3 smaller windows that looked out into a much larger room. Ticket booths. At the far end of that wall, nearest Fluttershy, was another door slightly ajar. Nestled between the door and the ticket booths was a notice board with only one note on it. Oh, if Rarity ever saw this mess! Fluttershy tilted her head slightly as her eyes settled on a wall at the far end of the room. There, some pony had carved on the wall, using what could have been a knife or some other sharp object, the phrase, "Don't go in the bathroom." She cast her eyes towards the washroom right beside it.
Okay,
Fluttershy squeaked in reply. She turned her gaze to settle upon the door next to the warning. If the pony she'd seen through the window had been there, that is the most likely place they could have gone. She hesitated at the threshold and cast a nervous glance down at it before once more surveying the empty room. In spite of the light from outside, it was uncomfortably dark, and she shivered slightly. She eyed the door at the other end of the room. If she was going to find help, she needed to go through that door. Again, she looked down at the threshold, and closing her eyes, whispered the words her father had told her about the dark, and stepped inside. The air within felt stuffy and bitter as she completely entered the room. Once again her eyes roved over the entire room, but just like the station platform, the room was empty. Building up her courage, she tried not to breathe through her nose as she carefully tread around the mess that littered the room, making her way over towards the door. Passing an old chair, which was pinned under an overturned table, Fluttershy let out a startled scream when it suddenly collapsed, allowing the table that it had been supporting to crash to the ground with a resounding bang. Her whole body jumped at least 5 feet in the air as the sound reverberated all around the room, assaulting her sensitive eardrums from every direction simultaneously. Her legs spun in the air as her wings instinctively took control and hurtled her back out the door. She rocketed back inside the train and under the bench, eyes screwed shut and cowering once more. Eventually, her heart rate returned to normal, and slinking out from under the bench, peered out at the open door and the black room beyond.
There's nothing but my imagination,
Fluttershy squeaked as she forced herself out from under the bench and back onto the platform. Walking back over to the open door, she once more called out for the mystery pony. Her own voice echoed within the room before vanishing altogether. Looking over at the collapsed mess she'd disturbed, she found herself wondering if the reason she wasn't getting a response was that the other pony was even more frightened than she. Granted, she'd never met such a pony, but there was always a first. If that was the case, maybe she could comfort them and help take her mind off the missing sky. Carefully, she sneaked into the room, cautiously wary of the furniture that lay scattered around the room as she headed over to the other door. As she reached it, she spied the note on the notice board and delayed exiting the room as she saw there were actually 2. One was tacked over the first. She leaned in close to read it.
"The sink is fine. Hickory has taken those pipes apart 4 times now and still nothing. Ratchet gear."
She lifted up the note to read the one underneath.
"Something is still blocking the sink. For the millionth time, I'm a chief, not a plumber. Fix it, or I quit. Short crust.
Fluttershy sighed as she let the first note fall back down. Nothing useful. She turned and gently pushed open the door. It squeaked loudly on rusty hinges as it swung open to softly bump to a stop against the wall behind it. Hiding behind the doorframe until it was completely open, Fluttershy peeked the tip of her head out so that she could see what lay beyond in the adjoining room. This appeared to be a waiting room of sorts. 3 rows of benches took up the center of the room, while a 4th bench was located at the far end, under a long, stained window that stubbornly refused to let any pony see out, although there was the minuscule amount of light shining in. Both the window and the bench were interrupted in the middle by a set of glass double doors. On the far opposite end of the room, there was a square staircase that sloped up before making a sharp right and disappearing into the darkness. The station clock, a design she recognized as being from the now defunct Bradbury Clock Company, hung from the center of the ceiling, facing both ways, its hands forever stuck at 3 a.m. Along the right side of the room, the wall was covered in a massive chalkboard that displayed departures and arrivals. The board was wiped clean. Discarded newspapers were shoved into a waste paper basket now overflowing with junk and spilling its contents onto the floor around it. Fluttershy's head fully extended into the room as she eyed the newspapers. For the first time since her arrival, she felt hope. She entered the room and eagerly trotted over to the waste paper basket to find any form of identification of where she was. Inside the waste paper basket, the newspapers lay scrunched up into balls and yellowing with many years. They dated with age, like the rings of a tree ranging from a springy golden yellow to a crumbling dull brown. Fluttershy shifted around until she found one that looked and felt like it was more recent compared with the rest, and fished it out. She unfurled it and held it up close to the window to read. The type was faded with age, much like the welcome sign out front, and all the letters were incomprehensible. The headlines were more understandable. This one showed 2 twin fillies, their faces obscured by the headlines where the ink in their names had been smeared across half the page, leaving their name as Warai. Apparently they had been killed in a tragic accident. The rest of the story was beyond recognition. She dropped the paper and sifted around inside for another. The more legible ones told of rock farms drying up and going broke. There were also a number of papers about what she assumed was this train station. Mysterious accidents, disappearances of night staff, and grisly deaths. She sighed with disappointment. They were too old and unreadable to give her any indication of where she was. She lowered the latest paper she picked up and looked around the room before her eyes settled on the stairs leading up. Did that pony go up there? If so, why were they hiding? What did they have to fear from her of all ponies? She cautiously walked over to the bottom of the square staircase and looked up. They proceeded halfway up the overall height of the room before making a sharp right out of her vision.
Hello?
She called out, her voice echoing off into the darkness.
Is any pony up there?
Only the silence responded. She looked around the waiting room once more. Had she even seen another pony? Had she seen her own reflection in the window? No. She was sure she saw hazel eyes. She blinked in frustration. Was her mind playing tricks on her? The words of her father flowed through her head. Granted, the sudden disappearance of the train drivers would cause her imagination to run amok. A muffled giggle echoed down from upstairs. Fluttershy turned her head upwards towards the ceiling. She heard that. Some pony was up there.
Hello?
She cried out, hope in her voice.
You up there, can you help me, please?
Then she paused. The giggle had been a foal's voice, a filly to be more precise. What was she doing here playing in an abandoned building all by herself? She would not be of any help. Her brow furrowed. No. If she were here, that would mean that there had to be a town nearby. A town where she could get some help. Plus, a little filly would be nice company in this dark, depressing place.
Excuse me, little one.
She called out, walking up the first few steps.
Can I please talk to you? I promise I won't let your parents know you're here. I just want to ask you in which direction the town is.
A second filly's giggle answered her, followed by 2 ponies galloping away upstairs. Had she a friend? Their hoofsteps echoed across the ceiling.
Wait!
Fluttershy charged on up the stairs. She rounded the staircase and after climbing up some more stairs, found herself in a large, empty room. No, not entirely empty. Stools and tables had been stacked neatly up along the edge of the wall that faced the windows. A look across to the opposite side of the room revealed a counter with a till and a desk plaque that said, "Closed." Behind that lay a large rectangular window with wooden shutters drawn, above which were situated advertisements for various sandwiches and drinks. This was a cafe. She eyed the pretty painted pictures of the sandwiches on the menu board. They did look very yummy. She licked her lips without even realizing it. She spied a swing door to the kitchen just in time to catch its movement ceasing. Some pony had just recently gone through there. She wandered over to the counter and peered over. The ancient cobweb-covered till beside her ironically displayed the fire engine red "No Sale" sign.
Hello?
She called out again. Her gaze settled back on the swing door that led into the kitchen, which was now still. She rounded the counter and pushed open the door. It was a small kitchen, with a long wooden table in the center. To her right lay a countertop where the readied food would be placed, and the shutters behind the counter closed off the view to the outside. They would have usually been open in warmer weather to keep the area cool. On the other side of the room, opposite the table, sat small and medium-sized chest freezers that would have stored bags of ice and other frozen foods. Above that were several shelves containing all sorts of pots, pans, dishes, bowls, cups, and utensils for both cooking and eating. Next to that was a fireplace with a large iron pot in the middle, a medium-sized wood-burning stove, and next to that sat 2 kettles with a frying pan still atop its surface. There was a large cupboard next to it that was now almost empty, save for a few opened bottles, cans, and salt and pepper shakers. Most likely a pantry. Finally, at the far end was a sink with a hinged ring on a rod attached to a pump for the water, like a hoof pump, if you will. There was nothing in there. She cast her gaze back upon the fireplace. There could be some wood in there that she could use for a makeshift torch. She paused, hesitant to enter the room. Like the rest of the building, it was dark and empty, but unlike the rest of the building, not much light made its way in here. Once again, she looked over at the fireplace before her eyes circumnavigated the entire room once more. It still remained as empty as the last time she'd seen it. She carefully entered the room, taking care to not disturb anything that could make a loud noise if it fell. She reached the fireplace and sighed, saddened to see that only ash and lumps of burned coal littered the bottom of the fireplace. An iron poker lay in its holder to one side. Eyeing it experimentally, she wondered if she could find some cloth, wrap it around the end, and figure out some way to light it that could suffice as a makeshift torch. Another quick survey of the room revealed no such material was available, but she would take the poker just in case she found some, and move towards the poker with her open mouth. Her head shot up at the sound that touched her ears. She looked around the empty kitchen. Nothing. She stood very still as her ears slowly swiveled from side to side. She could have sworn she heard something, like a whisper on the wind. There, her ears locked onto the sink. She fluttered over, and landing before it, peeked over the rim. The sink was stained from water constantly dripping down the back of it, creating a foul brown mark running up the back of the sink. The wooden hoof pump before it provided water, and from the looks of the grime and rust around its joints, probably wouldn't even work anytime soon, let alone provide clean water. She peered down the drain, unable to see much past the grime-covered sink trap. Her brow furrowed as she heard the sound again. Straining her hearing, it sounded like something was scratching the pipes. She leaned in closer. The sound of loud giggling echoed from behind her. Fluttershy gave a startled cry and spun 180 degrees. Save her own, the room was still devoid of life. The giggling foals could be heard scampering away through what sounded like a set of double swing doors before their hoof steps receded away down a hall. Fluttershy frowned in disapproval. That wasn't very nice. She was now starting to rethink her plan. If these foals were just going to play pranks on her, maybe she was better off not asking for their help. They might even give her directions to the town garbage dump or sewage plant just for laughs. Her muzzle wrinkled in disgust from the phantom smell that tickled her nose at that last idea, and paused in deep thought as a new theory about her stranding ran through her mind. What if this actually was a disused train station, and there had been something wrong with the train? The train would have needed to pull in, and the crew went into town to get help. What about the lights? If this station had lights, it would have to have a generator somewhere. If they were on, that meant the train crew would have gotten it up and running to give them the maximum amount of light to see what they were doing. Thus realizing after a thorough inspection that they needed help, had headed off to town, completely forgetting that she was on board. Another option that was also logical was, with the missing sky, they pulled into the station and headed for the nearest town to find out what was going on. She looked over at the closed shutters, as if looking past them to the outside. If there really were a nearby town, then there would have to be a path leading there. Those two foals would have had a path to follow. The tunnel she'd seen lead to the other side of the building, where she had not gone yet. What were the odds that there was a road or a path leading away from the station to the town? Ponies would have to travel on something to get to and from here. She dramatically rolled her eyes. Oh, why didn't she think of this before, instead of just charging off into this abandoned building and foolishly scaring herself in the process? She trotted over to the door, but as she placed a hoof up to push it open, she paused. There was that sound again. She turned and looked back at the sink. It was much more audible now. Her hoof left the door as she walked back to the sink, the sounds from the drain all the more clearer. As she peered over the rim, the noise stopped. Then she lowered her head down even further. She could have sworn she saw movement down there. A hairy spike abruptly shot out of the sink trap, and Fluttershy jerked her head back. It wiggled around violently before vanishing back into the drain. Fluttershy blinked in confusion. What the hay was that? There was a thump, then another. The sink trap bucked violently, then catapulted up into the air. Fluttershy watched it peak and fall back to earth, clattering down into the space between the sink and the pantry cupboard. She ignored it as she turned her attention back to the sink. A large, hairy, black spider was heaving its huge body out of the drain. Fluttershy's whole body locked up as her pupils dilated. The spider wrenched itself free and scuttled up the back end of the sink, climbing up the water pump before jumping onto the windowsill. It then began to scurry up the walls before reaching the roof and curling up in a corner of the room. Fluttershy watched it until it moved no more before shivering violently. She backed away towards the exit, all the while keeping her eyes locked on the nasty little thing. Normally, spiders did not bother her, but there was something about this one that just gave her the creeps. Another scraping sound caused her to lower her gaze back to the sink. A second spider was climbing out of the drain. No sooner had it freed itself than another spider crawled out after that. Then another and another. There were 5 spiders in the sink now, and more were coming. 8, 15, 23. Fluttershy took a few trembling steps away from the sink as the writhing mass of hairy black spiders grew, multiplying their numbers until they spilled out over the rim of the sink and onto the floor, scurrying in every direction. Fluttershy screamed and jumped up onto the wooden table as they began to spread out like water. She eyed them fearfully before snapping her gaze over at the door. She had to get out of here. She tore down the length of the table and leapt for the door, but smashed headlong into it as it refused to swing back the other way. She tried to pull it back towards her, but something held it fast. She spun around, watching as the spiders, now numbering in the hundreds, began to surge towards her as a living shadow, their little hairy legs skittering the floorboards in a chaotic rhythm. She spun back to the door and pulled harder. Why wouldn't it open? She pushed again and still nothing. She spun around and saw the spiders were crawling up the walls and along the ceiling, covering every inch of the room. Some were even dropping gracefully to the floor on long, thin strands of web. Again she spun around, sweat matting her fur as she again attempted in vain to open the door. Then she paused before shooting her gaze up and across to the closed wooden shutters. There was a rope on this side. She leapt for it, grabbing it with her teeth and yanking as hard as she could. The shutters rattled upwards before jamming against some unseen object within its mechanism. Fluttershy dropped the cord and observed. The shutters were up only halfway, but she could still squeeze her body through. 3 somethings landed in her mane and began violently struggling. Fluttershy screamed as she launched herself through the window, sliding under the shutters on her belly, out the other side and landing in a tangled heap just in front of the counter. She immediately jumped to her hooves and began batting at her mane, shrieking all the while. But there was nothing in her hair. She finally calmed down and stood still. The writhing had stopped. She collapsed to the floor, curled up in a tiny ball, and whimpering in terror.